In Mark chapter 7, we get this really interesting section of Jesus talking with some of the leaders of Israel. And as is common in these sections, Jesus is not super happy with them because, as he says over and over and over again, they have led people to abandon the commands of God and accept the commands of men, or follow after the commands of men. They have, instead of facilitating God's law and the keeping of it, instead of leading by example and reminding people of the heart of what God's law is, which is love God and love your neighbor, they have added things to the law. And I think initially we need to remember that perhaps this was done in correct motivation. They didn't want to break God's law. They wanted to show God love. They were trying to do the right thing, but they were so caught up in legalism and perfection that they had to make this hedge around the law. They added rules to it to kind of legislate how you were to keep the law. So instead of just rest on the Sabbath and don't do any customary work, it was, here's how much you can do without breaking the law. And that was kind of their rules. And they made the law a burden for the people of God so that people would either leave it altogether or focus on the nitty-gritty stuff on the outskirts of the law that were added to it rather than the core of the law, which was good and right and just and perfect and from God. So Jesus is not happy with the leadership because they have led people away from God and towards obedience to man or themselves. And they've often profited from this. And it's interesting because we read the sections on the Pharisees and Jesus scolding them. We're like, yeah, we get it. Those are kind of the bad guys in the New Testament. For the most part, at least, I think we kind of have this feel for them. But then we'll look back at the Old Testament and we're like, oh man, look at God's harsh punishment and judgment on the nations. But if you read closely, there is a very clear consistency of narrative here where God is often placing the blame squarely on the shoulders of those who lead his people, those who know better and instead don't do better, those who are supposed to lead by example but instead follow after corruption or other gods or foreign nations. And this is kind of the resounding thing that happens all throughout the Old Testament, and we see Jesus continuing this here, where yes, he's not happy with any who are following after sinful things, but the responsibility and a lot of the blame goes to those who lead people in that direction, those who should be respectable, those who should be, discerning the word of God and sharing it with the people. Instead, they are making it hard for the people to follow God's law and turning people away from it altogether. And so huge judgment is on these people. Now, there's still judgment on those who follow blindly after that kind of person. That's not a good thing to do either. But when responsibility is given to you, a lot is expected of you. Jesus is pretty clear on this topic too. But in this section in Mark 7, we see an example of this, a little tiny example, and I think we can learn from it because often, unfortunately, I think we can follow after the pattern of the Pharisees. And I want to make sure that we're not doing that. I know in my life I can, and I read sections like this, and it serves as a good warning. And so I want to offer it up to you today because I don't think it's impossible for us to do the things that they did just in different ways. But if we're not understanding the things that they did in context, then maybe we won't see it. We'll kind of miss the forest for the trees and think, well, we didn't do exactly that thing they were scolded for, and so I'm okay, not realizing that we're doing the heart of what they did in a very different way. So in Mark 7, verse 9, it says, he said to them, all too well, you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is corban, that is a gift to God, that you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such things you do. So corban, we get this really odd word here. What is this? Essentially, this was a way in which people could dedicate their belongings to God. And it probably started out as a pretty good thing. People had resources, they had material wealth, they had things in their possession that could help the temple or God's people in some way. And so they would make this ceremonial offering to the temple and to God and say, what I have belongs to him. It's in his service. It is his to do with as he pleases. And I bet some people did this with a really good heart. However, Jesus is pointing out that over time, people would do this and they would donate what they had to God ceremonially and not actually give it up. And then when their parents were old and needed assistance, needed help, instead of helping them and caring for them, they'd say, "Oh, sorry, my hands are tied. These things belong to God, so I legally can't sell them to help you out, or I can't use these in your service because they belong to God. They're in his service." And so it would allow their hearts to become corrupt because they could basically keep all of their possessions for themselves rather than lowering their standard of living to care for those who were supposed to be in their care. And this corban idea is a way of institutionalizing service to God or giving an offering to God. And the problem with this is clear. If you just ceremonially give something away and then say, I don't have to do any of the other parts of God's law because I'm doing the more important part of being sacrificial to God, I'm kind of, signing on the dotted line, and that makes me okay with God because I'm fulfilling a greater part of his command. Sorry, I can't do the rest of it. I don't really have anything to give you. But this is not what God intended. He did not mean for love of neighbor and love of God to be at odds with one another. Instead, when you love your neighbor, you are loving God. When you love God, you will be loving to your neighbor. These things are intimately related, but instead they were finding ways to institutionalize giving to God at the expense of giving to their neighbor. And this was wrong. Now, you might think, well, I'm not doing that. We don't have systems in our modern churches today where I can just ceremonially give my wealth to the church, but also maintain control of it so that I don't have to give to the poor or take care of my family. We don't have something like corban anymore, so how could I possibly be doing that? However, there are things that I think in a church setting we often are responsible for that look a lot like this. There are things we do that might end up kind of taking on the spirit of this thing where we say, well, that thing is kind of already wrapped up in this other service to God, and so I can't do this other part. We kind of segment off certain parts of the law or obedience to Christ, and then we think, well, as long as it's being taken care of somewhere else, it's fine. And this was the attitude of those people back in this time. They'd think, okay, well, there's government assistance for my parents. The temple will take care of them to some degree. Yes, they'll be poor. Yes, they'll be needy, but they're not going to be dying in the streets. They'll be fine, but I don't have to get rid of my stuff to help them. And I think there's one way in particular that we do this that I think feels comfortable, but really is not the best thing. We need to remember Christ gave his church a responsibility. When he left and he went away, he told his apostles, go and make disciples of all the nations, preach the gospel to all the creatures. And I think sometimes we have this feeling that the church does that. We give our money to the church, and so now we are freed from this portion of the command of God. We have done this one thing, and so we don't have to do this other thing. And we've made, in effect, one part of the law of God to no effect. We have rejected the law of God in favor of the command of men. Now, offerings and tithes, I do believe these are a commanded part of Christian life. I do think that we should be giving tithes and offerings to further God's work, to help to pay for those who are in his service full time in pastoral careers or working for churches. I think all of that is good, and those are parts of the command of God. However, beyond this, sometimes we feel as if, well, I made another donation, or, I spend my time at services, and so I'm doing this part to support the work, so I don't really have to do this other part. And this, to me, has the same spirit as this corban idea, where it's I've done one part of the law of God, someone else is going to take care of the other part, so I don't really need to. We've institutionalized one part of God's law and then wiped our hands of responsibility of it. And I don't think this is going to fly in the long run. We are all tasked with living lives that are different. We are all tasked with sharing our faith with others and giving a reason for the hope that lies within us. We are tasked with living in such a way that provokes questions in other people, where they look at us and say, something is different about you. You live a transformed life, something that I haven't seen exactly in this way before, and I want to know more about it. If you're not living that way, and you think you can just quietly give to the church and they can do the work for you, I think we're missing the point here. Now, again, I'm not trying to assign motive. I do think there are people that are just trying their best, and they think, okay, well, this is a system we have. Like, the church has more resources and I can give to them, and this is a good thing. Nothing wrong with that, but examine your heart to see if you're doing the thing the Pharisees were doing, where even some of them might have been doing it with a good heart, thinking, okay, I'll do this greater service by, playing my smaller part and allowing other people to play the bigger part. I'll kind of get out of their way. You could be doing that with a good heart, and it still might not be the right thing. It could just be misguided a little bit. However, this turned quickly for the Pharisees into something that was absolutely wrong. It was absolutely self-serving. It absolutely preserved them from something maybe they were afraid of doing, caring for their parents, lessening their wealth or their status. This is a thing that's scary for people to do. And so they found a way around God's law by doing what they believed fulfilled the law to a greater degree. And when Jesus came, he was not happy with this. When Jesus comes again, is he going to look at me and say, yeah, okay, you gave money to your church, that's wonderful, but you had so many opportunities to share your faith with people. You had so many opportunities to live differently, and you didn't. You had so many opportunities to let my light shine through you, and you covered it up. Is that going to be what he says about me? Is he going to say that I rejected the commandment of God, following after instead the traditions of men? This is a huge fear of mine. I think that when Jesus came, the Pharisees did not expect him to come in the way that he did, and they missed him altogether. They thought, I'm doing all the things I need to be doing, and so the Messiah will be happy when he comes back and sees me doing all these things. And instead, Jesus came and wasn't happy with them. And so they thought, this must not be him. The guy I'm expecting will be happy with my work. I don't want to fall into that same trap where I think I'm good with God. Everything I'm doing is honoring to him and good for him. I want to make sure that I'm examining myself and my actions so that I'm actually doing the commands of God. Yes, I also want to do those other things. I want to give to my church. I want to assist them in the work that they're doing. I want to advocate for the church to do a global work that I can't achieve on my own because I'm just one person. I want to do all those things, but I don't want to leave the commands of God undone. And this was something the Pharisees did that I never want to emulate.